Hello and welcome to the new season of NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. And who better to discuss ideas with than Professor Arvind Panagariya, renowned economist, professor of Indian political economy at Columbia University. He's also now Chancellor of Nalanda University, was the former head of the policy think tank of the government, the Niti Aayog, and a Padma Bhushan. Professor Panagariya, thank you very much for joining me on the Dialogues.
Pleasure to be back with you, Sonia.
Professor Panagariya, you're here at an interesting time. The countdown, the final countdown to the elections is well and truly on. And we had Prime Minister Modi say just last week that it's the Modi guarantee that India will be the third largest economy in the world in his third term. Now, that's something you predicted earlier, both that Prime Minister Modi would have a third term and that India would cross that third largest economy barrier. Why are you so sure of both of those?
Well, you know, the growth as it is happening, we grew, if you look at the pre-COVID era, we grew close to about 7% for the period. Last year, 1920 was slowed down. But other than that, if you take that year out, we did quite well. And it is the same growth rate which has to return, probably a little bit accelerated. For a number of reasons, which is, the balance sheets of the banks as well as the corporates are in good shape now. Savings and investment rates have picked up. Our investment rate is now back to about close to 34%, which is in several years it's the highest. And a lot of the reforms that were done ought to pay off. So all in all, I think, situation is quite good. Internationally, the global marketplace for us looks good as well, with the China +1 finally picking up for India. So for all those reasons, I think we'll easily sustain 7% plus, and that's enough for us to, by 28-29, cross the remaining two countries that are there between the United States and China on the upper side, and us in the fifth place.
Prime Minister Modi linked that, of course, with the fact that he would get a third term, and he was sure of that third term. You've said that too. Now, does that come from an economist perspective or from somebody who is a supporter of the Modi government?
No, look, I support a government which is in national interest, and Modi government is in national interest, so that's the reason I support him. But his victory, of course, will be well earned. The kind of progress we have made is quite unprecedented, especially in some of the areas. If you look at the infrastructure build-up, we have never had this kind of infrastructure build-up in such a short period of time. The capital expenditures have been raised at all-time high, and they have been actually used very effectively. So that is on one side of one part of it. Other, I think, his delivery of all the benefits has been impeccably good. The beneficiaries are receiving what is owed to them. And the economic growth is being maintained. Reforms have been done. There are some issues about which we can talk, where I have some reservations, like, on trade side and all. But that's only one of the many areas. In most other areas, I think the government has made very steady progress.
So, in fact, and you also had various international financial institutions point to the fact that they've actually raised India's growth projections. But at home, in the opposition, the former finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, has made the point that while India being the fifth largest economy makes us proud, the fact that per capita we had 128, that's the real issue we should be focusing on. You've seen in Parliament this week during various no confidence motion debates and other debates that the opposition has raised this point, that the cost of a thali, which is double what it was in UPA time. You've seen videos going viral of vegetable vendors, the poorest, making the point that they don't see themselves as improving, but in fact they see inequality levels rising.
Well, if you use the authority of Mr. Chidambaram, I have to also hit back, say that, it is well and good for him to say that we are 128th. Is it thanks to whom? I mean, who was ruling for the 50 years, 60 years? It is really the debacle that happened, near debacle, I shouldn't say it was complete debacle, but it was really the extremely low growth for 4 decades. which left us at near the bottom of the per capita income rankings. If anything, reforms by Prime Minister Vajpayee first and Prime Minister Modi. Before that, Prime Minister Rao, actually, of course, he deserves the greatest credit for having changed the entire direction of the policy. But those are the prime ministers which have really turned the economy around. And now, so that's one part. Comparing the size versus the per capita, once again, after all, size rises also because you raise the growth rate, and per capita income will also rise because you raise the growth rate. So there, for the level, it's really the responsibility of the governments that ran the economy for better part of the post-independence history of India. But for the growth rate, it is the current government which has to take the responsibility or credit, and I think that is the better way to judge. So that would be my response. On inflation, again, I have to come back and say, when what was handed over to Prime Minister Modi by the UPA was an economy that was running at a near 10% double-digit inflation. If you go back to 12, 13, 13, 14, very high current account deficits as well. So compared to that, now specific commodity prices, of course, this can happen, particularly for perishables like tomatoes is currently is the one. Onions has been a story in the past. So products that are perishable, they generally can spike. It's a concern, but overall the inflation rate actually is well below 6%, which is the well within the target range.
So you think we are on a comfortable roadmap to? We just had Mr. Sanyal also saying that we should be overtaking Germany now as the fourth largest soon. So do you think that on the current roadmap, this is where India will be headed sooner rather than later? What do you think are the big opportunities and challenges before we actually make it there?
Yeah. Well, as far as getting to number 3 is concerned, we are on our way. But I don't want to sort of from that infer that therefore we can sit back. Yeah. We have to ultimately be also looking at getting to number 2 in due course, and the sooner we accelerate growth rate now, faster we'll get there, because in the end if the growth pushes up the base on which the future growth will take place, then you get there faster, and that is something. So therefore, there's a number of things we ought to do. We can talk about it.
So in fact, Professor Bhagwati and you, and I think there was almost that rivalry with Professor Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze, where you believe very strongly, your books have also made this point, that growth is the best way for poverty reduction. And we've just had a UN report out which shows that India's had remarkable success in halving its poverty rate levels, its multi-poverty index rate levels, and also a Niti Aayog report which has pointed out that there have been very important reductions in multidimensional poverty in key Indian states like UP, Madhya Pradesh, the Bimaru states. Do you think that bears out what you've been saying? Because this, of course, was also a UPA clash where you had, say, the Prime Minister and Montague Singh pushing for much more pro-growth, and the NAC arguing against that and looking at more welfare measures. The Modi government is also putting out very strong welfare measures. The fact that 80 crore people are still getting subsidized food grain, free food grain. How do you think the two balance? Do you think growth is still the main driver, or do welfare schemes is something which is needed in a country like India where inequality levels are still very high?
Yeah. Look, there is general agreement on welfare schemes. Neither UPA would go against it, or they will be strongly in support, and we were always strongly in support of that as well. But if you try to do welfare schemes without doing things that sustain the high growth rate, then you have a problem, because then you will then begin to run into fiscal deficit issues and therefore inflation. And that's something that did happen in the second term of the UPA, that they tried to run very large expenditures without maintaining growth, and that resulted in both high deficits and high inflation rates. So there is no disagreement on the welfare schemes, and Prime Minister Modi knows, ultimately you are absolutely right. I agree that in a country like India, in a democracy, this will always be that, especially when billionaires are rising in numbers, politically you cannot afford and not to have the redistribution going alongside, and so in some sense, this is something that through the political process will automatically always happen. The issue always turns in on whether the delivery is effective or not, and where Prime Minister Modi has done a fabulous job is in ensuring that the delivery happens and the leakages are eliminated.
What's the advice you'd give now to a government which is now going into election mode? I mean, we're going to see much more focus on the politics in the run-up to the next election. There will be a budget, but in a sense that also would have an eye on the elections coming up. What would your advice be to a government which is going into election mode now, and to an entire political system going into election mode? Because that will be the big battle.
Yeah, so look, as an economist, I would still love to see some more reforms happen, but I also realistic that this is now election time, and therefore perhaps they will wait for the bigger reforms till after the elections have taken place. But therefore, I think right now for the government from the given where we are in terms of the elections coming up, I'd suggest doing is one, maintain good macroeconomic stability, right? Because if inflation gets out of hand, that can have a pretty major impact on the voter behavior. So that is something to watch out for, and generally, maintain policy stability also. Again, if unexpected things get done, that also leads to fallout. Businesses get
because in state after state, you've seen the election discourse is now very much about freebies and not, and we've seen that increasingly, whether it's been in Karnataka, whether it's been in election states coming up, where the focus seems to be on how governments across either side, whether it's BJP or Congress, will be announcing more and more schemes which seem to be basically freebies. Yeah.
Look, so my view on this is that, yes, I understand that this is, part of any democratic process that these freebies will be distributed, but responsible government should do freebies which are temporary, meaning which do not generate long-term liabilities. Irresponsible governments have the tendency to bring in election time something which then leads to results in very long-term liabilities, of which my favorite example is the return to old pension scheme. If you do that, you really are hitting your future governments very, very hard. That's not something that ought to be done just to win the elections, just because the liability can be transferred to a very future government. So that is what I would like the Modi government to resist, and also hopefully the opposition to resist. Do not create long-term liabilities just because of the election. Go ahead and do something which is temporary.
I said, interesting, because one of the areas you also looked at is focus on is exports, and said on how we should, India should be looking at really increasing that now, and perhaps in some areas, especially with the China +1, you talked about as geopolitics, but also in terms of exports to the world. Where do you think India can catch up on that? You controversially said that perhaps the rupee should depreciate further.
I will say it again. Yes, I do believe that the exchange rate matters a lot for the exporters. There is also another reason why actually depreciation of the rupee is a helpful measure, because what happens is that that also provides a cushion to the import competing producers, producers who are facing competition from foreign goods in our own domestic market. And then therefore, when that happens, there is always this sort of tendency for the government to respond by raising the tariffs. But if you really let the rupee depreciate, then the necessary cushion is provided to the producers of the import competing goods, and the pressure on tariffs then is taken away. Between the two, I would much rather have the exchange rate change, because that exchange rate change will also then provide the incentive for the exporters.
And also you talked about policy stability, but the fact is that the recent announcement of curbs on a laptop and a tablet imports, and first one date is announced and the date is pushed further. So do you think that these kind of surprises, what do you think the reasoning is behind it, and what would you say about this decision?
Yeah. No, this one really worries me. This one really worries me. I think, I symbolically also I see this as, a measure that belongs to the license permit Raj era. And it symbolizes that I'll be falling back into that. I hope not. But so that one really, both because it's a measure that I thought we had left behind, as well as surprise. So it automatically raises doubts in minds of others that look, is this a one-off thing, or now more of this is going to be done? Now, why we have done it, I do not know. We can only speculate. Government, to my knowledge, I think the government has provided no explanation for or no reasons as to why this was done. We can speculate. Maybe it was import substitution. Maybe it was because PLI is ending at 31st of August, and so it is do that. Maybe because in this particular category, what is called the harmonized system, category 8471, which is subject of the action. Right. In that category, imports from China had gone up by about $3 billion about 2 years ago, and they have stayed at that elevated level from China. So maybe China is the target of this action. So those are the possibilities. We don't know precisely what thinking went into Commerce Ministry's minds to take that
It's important to hear your views on that. But also, of course, interestingly, we have been talking about the Indian general election, but we have a US general election coming up. And I think what has been an interesting shift in that sense, and looking at it geopolitically, has been the India-US relationship in terms of both the strategic, also the economic, and the fact with the Indian huge aviation industries orders. You had President Biden thanking India for providing jobs in America, yes, which was an interesting turn for the books, from Bangalore to now India giving American jobs. Yeah. So what do you think, for you, as somebody, of course, is at Columbia University and the Jagdish Bhagwati professor there, what for you has been the biggest strategic shift there for you? And after all, this is a Democrat administration, not a Trump administration.
Yes, yes. No, look, if you look at the history, since Prime Minister Vajpayee's days, this relationship has continued to flourish and continue to rise, actually, in warmth and engagement. Presidents have changed on the US side, prime ministers have changed on the Indian side, but this improvement has happened continuously. Now, there has been, nevertheless, a major shift, the major jump in this relationship under Prime Minister Modi right now. And there are a couple of reasons, I think. One is the geopolitics has begun to shift. The United States very much sees China as a threat. China wants to become the global power, but before becoming global power, it has to become a regional power. And who stands in the way of China on the way to becoming a regional hegemon? It's India. And the United States sees that, one way to stop China is to not even let it become the regional hegemon.
And despite the fact that India went very much against the US line on Ukraine and Russia, and India very much carved its own path there.
Yeah. No, I think that's much credit, kudos to the Prime Minister, because he really navigated it so incredibly well. Initially we were criticized and all, but we stood ground. And both Prime Minister Modi and our External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, they handled the questions and the criticisms incredibly well, explained that what kind of history lies behind our position on Russia. And I think at the end of the day, the United States has come to very much accept it, come to appreciate it. And if anything, the United States is even warmer than it was before Russia-Ukraine. So
and finally, Professor Panagariya, as we wrap up on dialogues, we said it's a conversation of ideas. For you, what is the big idea that should be defining India in the next decade? Let's forget about next year's elections, state elections. In India, we're always in some election mode. What for you should be the big defining idea for India in the next decade?
Well, we have to globalize. I think, it's not a new idea, it's an old idea, but that doesn't mean that that's not a good idea. That should really define us, that, we are very much arriving on the globe, both economically and geopolitically. We should look to becoming a member of the Security Council in the United Nations. We should have much greater weight on the other international institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. All of that, in my thinking, goes with the economic growth as our economic heft rises. But economic heft would rise a lot faster if we are big players in the global economy. We ought to have a much bigger share in the global trade than we currently do.
Well, it's interesting you say that, as India's G20 presidency is coming to an end. We have a big G20 summit coming up. Now, you, of course, have been India's G20 Sherpa. The current Russia-Ukraine standoff may perhaps affect the communique, but what for you has been the big defining moment of this 1 year of India's G20 presidency? Why is it important? Because we had a lot of opposition saying that, it's a routine affair. Every country becomes a G20 presidency. How has India made this different?
Well, something like this is whatever you make of it. And the Prime Minister has really made G20 presidency of India truly major event, both internationally and domestically. This kind of buzz, as you said, I was Sherpa for 3 different presidencies, and I went to China, I went to Germany, went to Turkey, but this kind of buzz never existed. So that alone, I think, is something to celebrate. But also, I have to say that we have a tough task cut out for us because geopolitically, this is a very tough time for any presidency. But I'm just confident that Prime Minister Modi is a master at it, and we will navigate it well enough, and we'll have at the end of the day a communique on which everybody agrees, even though the positions are a bit difficult right now. The US position seems to have also hardened on this, but I have full confidence in Prime Minister Modi, Mr. Jaishankar. I think we'll get there.
Professor Panagariya, thank you very much for being on the NDTV Dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. My pleasure.
Thank you.